Why does God let them hurt you? Why does he allow the suffering, the betrayal, the pain? You cry out in the night asking, Lord, where are you? Why didn't you stop them? Why did you let me break like this? And the silence feels unbearable. But listen closely. God is not absent. He is not blind. He is not deaf to your cries. There is something happening in the unseen, something deeper than your pain, something that will shake you to your core if you open your heart to see it. Look at Joseph, a young man favored by his father but despised by his own brothers. They threw him into a pit, sold him like an animal, and walked away as if he were dead. He cried for help. He begged them to stop, but God let it happen. He let the chains bite into Joseph's wrists. He let the prison doors slam shut. He let him sit there for years, abandoned, forgotten. But was he really forgotten? No, because in that suffering, God was preparing something greater. The very ones who betrayed him would one day bow before him. The pain was the process that led to purpose. The rejection was the road to the throne. And what about Job, a righteous man, faithful, blameless? And yet in a single day he lost everything, his wealth, his children, his health. His friends accused him. His wife told him to curse God and die. And Job, covered in sores, scraping himself with broken pottery, cried out in agony. But God was still there. And in the end, Job saw what he could not see before, that even in the suffering, God was working, refining, and restoring. Job received twice what he had lost. The pain had a purpose. The suffering was not wasted. Some of you have been betrayed by people you trusted. Some of you have been abandoned, falsely accused, mistreated, and you wonder, why did God let this happen? But listen, God is not finished yet. What the enemy meant for evil, God is turning for good. The pit is not your prison, it is your preparation. The betrayal is not the final chapter, it is your beginning. The suffering is not the final chapter, it is the setup for your testimony. And let's not forget the cross. If there was ever a moment when it seemed like God had abandoned the innocent, it was that day on Calvary. Jesus, beaten, mocked, nailed to a cross, left to die. The Son of God cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And heaven seemed silent. But was it really the end? No, because 3 days later the grave was empty. The pain of the cross became the power of salvation. The suffering led to victory. God allows the hurt, not because he is cruel, but because he is doing something far greater than we can understand. He is shaping you, refining you, strengthening you. He is preparing you for something you cannot yet see. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the suffering, they are not meaningless. They are the tools he is using to bring you into your destiny. So don't give up. Don't let the pain make you bitter. Don't let the hurt define you. Trust in the God who brings beauty from ashes, who turns mourning into dancing, who takes what was meant to destroy you and uses it to elevate you. The hurt may have come, but it will not have the final say. God is still in control. And when the story is finished, you will look back and see that what hurt you was the very thing God used to set you free. You may be walking through a season of pain, questioning why God has allowed it. The betrayal, the rejection, the loss, it feels unbearable. You cry out to God asking, why did you let this happen? But what if I told you that your suffering is not a mistake? What if I told you that the very thing breaking you is actually preparing you? Look at Joseph, a young man with dreams, favored by his father but despised by his brothers. One moment he was wearing a coat of many colors, the next he was thrown into a pit. His own flesh and blood betrayed him, selling him into slavery as if he were worth nothing. Imagine the heartbreak, the confusion. He must have wondered, God, where are you? I thought you gave me a dream. Yet God did not stop the betrayal. He did not stop the suffering. Joseph was dragged away in chains, sold into a foreign land, and later imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. Year after year he suffered. But was it all for nothing? No. What Joseph could not see in the pit, what he could not understand in the prison, was that every moment of pain was pushing him toward his destiny. The betrayal set him on a course that led to the palace. The suffering was not a detour, it was the very road God used to fulfill his promise. If Joseph had never been sold, he would have never entered Egypt. If he had never entered Egypt, he would have never stood before Pharaoh. If he had never stood before Pharaoh, he would have never been placed in a position to save an entire nation. The very thing meant to destroy him was the thing that lifted him. And the same is true for you. The pain you are facing is not wasted. The people who hurt you may have meant it for evil, but God is using it for good. You may not see it yet, but there is something happening behind the scenes. God is positioning you, shaping you, preparing you. The suffering is painful, but it is not pointless. Just like Joseph, you will one day look back and realize that what felt like destruction was actually preparation for something greater. What broke you is what will build you. The pit is not your end. It is the beginning of the journey to your purpose. There are moments in life when the very people you trusted the most are the ones who wound you the deepest. The betrayal, the rejection, it cuts like a knife. You gave them your heart, your loyalty, your trust, and in return, they turned their backs on you. They lied about you, abandoned you, mistreated you, and you asked God, why? Why did you let them do this to me? But what if I told you that their betrayal was not the end of you? What if I told you that their rejection was actually part of God's plan to take you where you were meant to be? Look at Joseph. His own brothers threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and walked away as if he were dead. They thought they had gotten rid of him. They thought they had destroyed his future. But what they didn't know was that God was using their betrayal to position Joseph exactly where he needed to be. The enemy thought he was burying Joseph, but God was planting him. And in time, that seed grew into something powerful. The very ones who betrayed Joseph would later come to him, desperate for help, not even realizing they were bowing before the brother they had once discarded. The same thing happened to Jesus. He was rejected by his own people, abandoned by his disciples, and betrayed by one of his closest followers. The ones who should have stood by him turned against him. He was beaten, humiliated, and nailed to a cross by the very people he came to save. But did their betrayal stop God's plan? No. Their rejection was part of the process. What they meant for harm, God used for the greatest victory the world has ever seen. Through the suffering of Jesus, salvation was made possible for all. The cross was not defeat, it was the setup for resurrection. So listen to me. The people who walked away from you, the ones who turned against you, they did not ruin your destiny. They only played their part in pushing you toward it. Their betrayal did not break God's plan, it activated it. What the enemy meant for harm, God is using for good. You may not see it yet, but the very thing that hurt you is the very thing God will use to elevate you. Their rejection was not your downfall. It was your setup for something greater. There comes a time in every believer's life when faith is tested in the fire of suffering. You pray, but the heavens seem silent. You cry, but the pain doesn't stop. You wonder, is this a punishment? Has God forgotten me? But listen, what you are going through is not a punishment. It is a test. a test of faith, a test of endurance, a test to see if you will trust God even when everything is stripped away. Look at Job, a man who was blameless, upright, faithful to God. He had everything, a family, wealth, health, and honor. Then in a single moment, everything was taken. His livestock was stolen. His servants were killed. His children died in a tragic disaster. And if that wasn't enough, his body was struck with painful sores. The man who once lived in abundance was now sitting in ashes, scraping his wounds with broken pottery. His friends accused him. His wife told him to curse God and die. And Job, overwhelmed with suffering, cried out to God, asking, why? But notice something. God did not answer Job right away. Heaven was silent. Job did not know that this was not about punishment, but about proving his faith. Satan had accused Job before God, saying, take everything away from him and he will curse you. But God knew Job's heart. He knew that Job's faith was not built on blessings, but on trust. And though Job questioned, though he wept, though he did not understand, he never turned away from God. He held on, even when everything was gone. And in the end, God restored him. Not only did Job receive back what he lost, he received double. And that is what God does for those who endure. When your faith is tested, when suffering comes, it is not to destroy you, it is to refine you. Will you trust God when the blessings are gone? Will you hold on when you don't understand? That is the test. The ones who endure, the ones who refuse to let go, will see restoration beyond what they ever imagined. The suffering is not the end of your story. If you remain faithful, God will bring you out of this stronger, wiser, and more blessed than before. Your pain is not for nothing. Your suffering is a test. And on the other side of it, there is a reward. Hold on. God is not finished yet. There is no suffering deeper than the suffering of the cross. There is no betrayal more painful than what Jesus endured. He was the Son of God, the perfect, sinless Lamb. He healed the sick, raised the dead, and preached the kingdom of heaven. He loved without condition, and yet he was despised, rejected, and sentenced to die. The people he came to save were the ones who shouted, "Crucify him." The ones who once followed him turned their backs. One of his own disciples, Judas, sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Another, Peter, swore he didn't even know him. They mocked him, spit on him, beat him beyond recognition. And there he was, the King of Kings, standing before a crowd, stripped of his dignity, wearing a crown of thorns, carrying a cross up a hill. As he hung there, nails driven through his hands and feet, struggling for every breath, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If there was ever a moment that looked like defeat, it was this. The sky turned dark, the earth shook, and then he took his final breath. The Savior of the world died. But was it really the end? No. What looked like the greatest loss became the greatest victory. On the third day, the tomb was empty. Death could not hold him. The grave had no power over him. His suffering led to salvation. His pain led to redemption. The very suffering that seemed unbearable was the very thing that brought eternal life to all who believe. If God did not spare his own son from suffering, do you think he will spare you? If Jesus had to endure pain for a greater purpose, do you not think God is working through your suffering too? Your pain is not without meaning. Your suffering is not the end. Just as the cross led to resurrection, your suffering is leading to something greater. God is using it to refine you, to strengthen you, to bring about something you cannot yet see. The suffering is painful, but the purpose is greater. If Jesus endured and overcame, so will you. The suffering is not your final chapter. Resurrection is coming, Victory is coming. Hold on, because God is not finished with you yet. There are moments in life when you cry out to God, but all you hear is silence. You pray, but nothing changes. You beg for answers, but heaven seems distant. You ask God, where are you? Why aren't you speaking? Why aren't you fixing this? The silence is heavy. It feels like abandonment. But listen to me, God's silence does not mean he is absent. Just because you don't hear him doesn't mean he's not working. Look at Joseph, betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. Year after year, he waited. He had dreams of greatness, promises from God, but instead of a throne, he found himself in a dungeon, and God was silent. No angels appeared. No voice from heaven reassured him. Yet behind the scenes, God was moving. He was orchestrating events, positioning people, preparing the moment when Joseph would be lifted from the prison to the palace in a single day. The silence was not absence, it was preparation. And what about Job, a man who lost everything, his wealth, his children, his health? His friends accused him. His wife told him to curse God and die. And in his suffering, God was silent. Job cried out, demanded answers, pleaded for relief. But for a long time, God said nothing. Was he absent? No. He was watching. He was testing Job's faith, refining him through the fire of suffering. And when the silence was finally broken, Job saw God like never before. His faith had been deepened, his understanding expanded, and in the end, God restored him with double blessings. Even Jesus experienced the silence of God. As he hung on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet, in that moment of divine silence, the greatest victory was being accomplished. Salvation for all mankind. If you are walking through a season where God seems silent, don't mistake it for abandonment. He is still there. He is still working. The silence is not the end. It is the setup for what he is about to do. Trust him. Keep believing. Because when God finally speaks, when he finally moves, you will see that he was never absent. He was always in control, working behind the scenes for your good. The very thing that broke you, the pain that nearly destroyed you, will one day be the testimony that brings you victory. Right now, you may not see it. Right now, all you feel is the weight of what you've been through, the betrayal, the loss, the rejection, the suffering. You wonder why God allowed it, why he didn't stop it. But listen to me, the pain you're walking through is not the end of your story. One day, the thing that hurt you will be the very thing that proves God's power in your life. Look at Joseph. He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked in a prison cell. He had every reason to be bitter, every reason to believe his life was ruined, but God was not finished. The same Joseph who suffered in silence for years was the same Joseph who was lifted up and placed in a position of power. The very people who hurt him, the brothers who betrayed him, had to stand before him, desperate for help. And what did Joseph say? "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." His pain became his testimony. His suffering became the proof of God's faithfulness. Look at Job. He lost everything, his wealth, his family, his health. He sat in the ashes, broken and grieving. But when it was all over, when Job had endured the test, God restored him, giving him twice what he had lost. The story of his suffering became a testimony of God's faithfulness, and for generations, people have looked at Job's life as proof that God never abandons his children. And what about you? What if the pain you are facing right now is not a curse, but a setup? What if the very thing that hurt you will be the thing God uses to lift you up? One day you will look back at this season and see that every tear, every heartbreak, every betrayal was shaping you for something greater. You will stand and tell your story not as a victim, but as a testimony of what God has done. The pain was real, but so is God's power. The suffering was deep, but so is his restoration. What the enemy meant to break you, God will use to bless you. Your pain will not be wasted. It will become the testimony that shows the world just how faithful God is. Hold on, because your story is not over.